Hello, Library Company's Fireside Chat. I am Jessica Chopin-Roney, and I am honored today to be hosting this event. And you can see here on your screen with me is Sean Griffin, who is the person of the day. So I'd like to start by thanking Grace Harrington, who is the Library Company Events Coordinator, for getting all of this together for us, and to say welcome to all of you. The Library Company has a number of exciting events. If you were here early enough to see the slides scrolling through, then you saw some of them. I just want to bring them to your attention very quickly. On December 11th, we will have a chat an in-person event with Seth Rockman, which I've just put into the chat. He is going to be hosting an in-person Library Company event on his book, Plantation Goods, A Material History of American Slavery, which was just published. In fact, I still don't have my copy. It's in the mail. Then on December 19th, we will have a fireside chat with Randy Brown, who will be speaking about his new book, The Driver's Story, Labor and Power in the World of Atlantic Slavery. And that's going to be very exciting. It's going to be him, and he'll be in conversation with Justine Hill Edwards. And that can be found here. And then finally, I want to draw your attention to a really exciting event in February, which is that PEAS is having a conference called PEAS at 25, Retrospect and Prospect. And this is celebrating the fact that the program in Early American Economy and Society, of which I am now the director, is celebrating its 25th year. So we're using this as an opportunity to look at the past 25 years and what the program has accomplished, and forward to the next 25 years and what we hope to accomplish next, asking the big question of what is the state of the field now? What are the big questions? Where's the energy? Where should we be going next? So it's a very exciting program, and I hope that you will join us. It will be February 7th through the 8th, 2025 here in Philadelphia. And then one last plug, I would like to let you know about the opportunity of becoming a Library Company shareholder. I am a shareholder. I have been a shareholder for, since 2008. I can't do the math at the moment. It started in 1731 as a program that was, a shareholding library where everybody held equal shares and was then able to borrow the books. It is still a shareholding library, and you can hold a share that is numbered and has been passed down over time. So, for example, I hold share number 889, which was originally held by Ezra Stiles Eli. And whenever I give up my share, the next shareholder will have the whole lineage of who has held that share over time. So in this time of increased precarity and adversity for many cultural and historical organizations, I urge you to consider supporting the Library Company by becoming a shareholder. The Library Company's original mission was to pour forth benefits for the common good. That's the motto that you see around that image that's also on our screen here. In the modern era, this mission includes supporting the scholarship of historians like Sean Griffin, who was a fellow at the Library Company, and also supporting events like this, which disseminate his teaching, his ideas, to a larger audience. All right. So let me tell you a bit about Sean Griffin. He is a historian of 19th century America with research interests in transatlantic slavery, anti-slavery, radical social and political movements, capitalism, and labor history, and intellectual and political history. So it's a rich book spanning so many methodological and eras. Anyway, we'll go on. So his first book is The Root and Branch, Working Class Reform and Anti-Slavery, 1790. You'll see a better image in a moment. Sorry about that. 1790 to 1860, which just came out with Penn Press. Sean teaches history at the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art in New York City. He received several prestigious awards, including postdoctoral fellowships from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Antiquarian Society, and of course, most importantly, the Library Company of Philadelphia. In addition to his work as a scholar and teacher, Sean has contributed to museum exhibitions and projects at the Center for Brooklyn History, the New York Historical Society, and other public history institutions. All right, now with all that out of the way, we're going to jump in. So the format here is, instead of just straight up giving you a book talk, Sean and I met before and kind of came up with the list of questions that I'm going to ask, and he's going to use as a way of sort of jumping into the topic. And so you'll see him give some slides, you'll hear me ask some questions. We'll be sort of going back and forth, and then we'll leave some time at the end for questions. So without further ado, I'll jump into the first one, which is to say welcome, Sean, in the first place. And second, what drew you to this topic? Like, what made you put together and want to write about the relationship between anti-slavery and labor reform?
Well, thank you, Jess. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks to you. But just before I answer, and to the library company, it is a really great institution. And as you mentioned, I was a Pease Fellow a couple of years ago, and during the pandemic, unfortunately, I had to do the fellowship remotely. But everybody was super helpful. Librarians, Kathy Madsen, who was running the program at the time, and sort of scanning materials for me and so on. And I got a lot of really great material, some of which I'll share with you. But yeah, I sort of latched on to this topic in graduate school. My interest in kind of antebellum labor reform started before grad school. I was inspired by Sean Wilentze's Chance Democratic, which paints this very evocative portrait of labor and radical movements in antebellum New York City. And I had always found the abolitionist movement to be very inspiring. And I started to delve more into the history of that, into the history of slavery and anti-slavery under my advisor, James Oakes at CUNY. Around the same time, some of the recent literature on slavery and capitalism was coming out. Things by, I'm thinking of Walter Johnson and Ed Baptist and Caitlin Rosenthal and Sven Beckert. But most of those had kind of little to say about the role of wage labor, or even about industrialization for that matter, or about wage laborers themselves, which is sort of how capitalism has been more traditionally understood. So there's this question of, if slavery was capitalist and 19th century American capitalism was so predicated on slavery, what was the role of free labor in that relationship? The whiteness literature, folks like David Roediger had been around for a while and was very influential to me. But I was not, I didn't find the whiteness explanation totally satisfying. And then there was a set of questions raised by David Bryan Davis, sometimes referred to as the Davis thesis, which posited that the abolitionists, on the other hand, had so internalized the values of capitalism that they were essentially, it sort of blinded them to the plight of non-slave workers. So there were like all these strains of literature kind of dancing around this question of free laborers vis-a-vis slavery, but only a few works that address that question directly, and most of those were older. So the short answer is I was just unsatisfied with the existing literature and thought there had to be more to it. And this dissertation, now book, is what I came up with. Little did I know at the time that I was delving into, some of the thorniest really problems, I think, in early American history, which we'll talk about. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. And Jess, if you want to pose the next question, let me get this.
Yeah, well, so one of the, I mean, it is, it seems like it has a pertinence and a relevance, this book, in a way that was true anyway, but particularly true after the last election. But jumping into the book, I mean, you self-describe as an intellectual historian as well as a labor historian, and you identify in this book a number of different strains or ideologies that influenced the early labor movement. How do you see those intersecting with anti-slavery, with the earliest sort of iterations or ideas around anti-slavery?
Yeah, well, to sort of just describe what the early labor movement in the United States was, on one hand, workers before the Civil War were demanding many of the same things that the labor movement did later. Higher wages, better conditions, the right to strike, the right to form trade unions, public education, a big one actually, laws limiting the workday to 10 hours, later it became 8 hours. But before the Civil War, there was, I think, kind of less of a universal acceptance or just resignation to the new realities of industrial capitalism and wage labor, and a sense that it was still possible to develop an alternative, right? One that would be more in keeping with what working people, many of them anyway, understood as the independence that was promised to them by the American Revolution and the Republican system of government, kind of summed up in what they referred to as a right to the fruits of one's labor. And there were many ways they tried to sort of realize this, some of them quite innovative, various experiments with organizing labor cooperatively and, Josiah Warren's labor for labor notes, this sort of system of exchange and mutual aid societies and producers co-ops and profit sharing schemes. But the two ones I write about in the book are, could be described kind of broadly as communitarian or utopian socialists. And I'll talk a little bit about them. Groups like the Owenites, the Fourierists, also known as associationists,
Mhm.
and their idea was sort of to escape the overcompetition caused by wage labor by forming these communities located often out in the hinterlands. And there they experimented with various forms of cooperative and sort of communal labor. None of them, by the way, particularly successful. But the associationists, or Fourierists in particular, were very perceptive in the ways that they critiqued wage labor and capitalism. And they were concerned about the connections between capitalism and slavery. So there's very interesting intellectual history there. And there was also a strong overlap that I found between association and anti-slavery, especially people like, some of whom were intellectuals, like Horace Greeley, who was the editor of the New York Tribune, but someone quite well known. William H. Channing, who was a Universalist minister and sort of the scion of this anti-slavery New England family, and John A. Collins, who was in the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. All of them were associationists at one point, and even William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass were sort of Fourier curious. I could put it that way, although they were also critical of some of these movements. And these experiments attracted a lot of working class support. They were led sort of by middle class intellectuals. The other major strain, though, is really land reform. And they were probably more genuinely working class in some ways. And the land reformers were building ideas that in some ways go back to the English Civil War, and things like Agrarian Justice by Tom Paine. And actually Philadelphia, we're not talking as much about Philadelphia as sort of the description, but Philadelphia has an important role here because it's the Philadelphia Working Men's Party that's sort of the first to raise this idea in the late 1820s of, petitioning Congress to place the public lands within the reach of ordinary workers. And then in the 1840s, George Henry Evans, who's a radical English immigrant printer in New York City, along with a group of other artisans, founds this group they call the National Reform Association, which becomes the leading land reform organization. And their argument is a simple one, that the public lands, which are depicted on the map here, huge swaths of the country, especially as the country's expanding in the 1840s and 50s. And of course, one problem that they sort of fail to address adequately, although they do address it, but, of course, these lands are inhabited by Native Americans, something we could talk about maybe later during the Q&A if people wish. But the basic idea is that the public land should be given away in these small 160-acre tracts for free by the government to actual settlers, right, as opposed to land speculators, the folks Michael Blakeman was talking about the other week, or railroad companies or other companies. And this, they think, is going to be the solution to over-competition and crowding and mechanization, and sort of all these threats to workers' independence. I can talk more about how they intersected with anti-slavery. I wanted to share this image just because this also shows, I think, some of the overlap with the communitarians. There's sort of a utopian, planning to this. This is a plan for national reform, what they call a rural Republican township. So, you see this sort of grid plan with 160-acre farms laid out, but they I think the land reformers were articulating something that on one hand was genuinely radical, and on the other is well within the mainstream of American political and Republican culture. Right? The idea that access to land is a God-given right, that it should be available to everyone. On the other hand, right, they're radical in the sense that they deny that anything like a right to property and land exists, period, right? Which is similar to the argument that abolitionists are making that property in man, aka slavery, is unnatural and contrary to the laws of God and contrary to the Constitution. So there's a sort of overlap there, but on a more basic level, right, it also aligns them with the political abolitionists, the Free Soil, later the Republican Party, who they're really focused on the expansion of slavery into the West, right? And they sort of share the identification of that as a big threat to their freedom, their vision of independence.
Hmm. Well, in some ways, these ideologies that you describe lead to some moments of overlap between the anti-slavery and the labor movements. Certainly more, this is part of what your book is contributing, is to say it exists at all, which I think many people overlook. And you're showing the ways that there is actually overlap, even as you recognize that there is a great deal of tension, significant differences and tensions between the labor movements, these radical labor movements, and anti-slavery advocates. Why were so many labor leaders and other working class folks in the North reluctant to embrace anti-slavery, and why were even some of them pro-slavery? How do those two things go together?
Yeah, you sort of have to hunt for it, first of all, and read between the lines a little bit, but it is there. They are talking about
Sorry, what is the it? Where
the,
they do overlap?
just finding labor reformers sort of making that, a central issue, number one. But yeah, I mean, it kind of cuts against our assumptions that we might have if the labor movement was aiming to improve the lives of working people, why would they ignore the plight of enslaved workers? And, if as nearly everyone agreed, the existence of slavery degraded the status of labor, why would they tolerate it, or in some cases even align themselves with slaveholders? So again, sort of in modern terms, were they voting against their own interests? As some have suggested. I think it's a little more complicated, and there's a lot of factors. And I try to be fairly nuanced in the book and my approach to this, even though I'm sort of arguing for, in favor of, showing the connections, showing the overlap with anti-slavery. But, clearly race and racism was a factor. The whiteness scholarship has demonstrated this. And some labor leaders, a notorious one was from Philadelphia, was John Campbell, who writes this sort of virulently racist tract in the, I think it's late 1840s, early 1850s. But even those who were, we could put in the anti-slavery column, people like George Henry Evans, leader of the National Reform Association, often resorted to this language of wage slavery or white slavery, and they really in order to emphasize the plight of white Northern workers. And you see this in things like the Wilmot Proviso too, where David Wilmot talks about, wanting to preserve the territories for free white labor. Pro-slavery types also tried to stoke fears about competition from African Americans and formerly enslaved folks in the event that they were emancipated, although, honestly, I didn't really find much evidence of that, at least in the thinking of labor leaders and reformers. But ultimately, I think it did boil down to a matter of prioritization. I called this book The Root and the Branch because there's this disagreement, and not just between labor reformers and abolitionists, but within the labor movement itself, over which was the root, which was merely a branch of labor's oppression, right? In other words, was slavery the root of all evil, something that poisons everything around it, as abolitionists believed? Or was it merely one form of the exploitation of labor, right, that could be traced back to feudalism and the divine right of kings? The abolitionists, too, were not blameless when it came to stoking some of these tensions. Garrison and Wendell Phillips both later come around to become strong supporters of the labor movement, but they, kind of initially deny there's anything exploitative about wage labor, and they can be quite dismissive and rebuffing labor reformers in the early days. in some sense, I think that hostility stretches back to the earlier anti-slavery movement in Britain, something we could talk about, where there's sort of these early tensions going back to the 1790s. But, ultimately, I think both sides are a little short-sighted, as social movements often are. The abolitionists, I think, at times at least, were so focused on slavery that they were less attuned to other forms of labor exploitation. They failed to foresee, by and large, that enslaved people would need access to the means of independence, the means of economic livelihood after emancipation, and labor reformers failed to recognize what was uniquely exploitative and horrific about racialized chattel slavery.
Well, I mean, in line with that, one of the things you talk about is the way that they articulate this idea of wage slavery. And of course, people have been throwing around, white folks in America had been throwing away around the term slavery in the 18th century in a political context. But you're showing how, with the rise of plantation slavery, sort of in combination with the Industrial Revolution, the idea of wage slavery or even white slavery is a term that they're using. So what do reformers mean when they're deploying that term, and how does it shape, like as they're applying to themselves this idea of wage slavery or white slavery, how does that affect the way that they're seeing uh, a, actual, if I'm not being too crass about it, slavery, chattel slavery?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, it really is ubiquitous in the 19th century, the language of wage slavery. And the answer sort of depends on who's using it and for what ends. But essentially, it implies that wage laborers or child laborers or women laborers or sailors or convict laborers, it gets applied to all these different groups where, we're sort of the virtual slaves. And, some people, I think, mean it more, more for its sort of metaphorical impact. Others are sort of, saying, no, really, it's, akin to chattel slavery. Again, I think there's show you, this is frontispiece to a book by Richard Cobden, who was an English sort of radical, although he was a member of parliament, someone, upper or middle class. But, it also can be traced back. I think there's a genealogy that goes back to sort of earlier struggles in Great Britain, where, arguably it may have been easier to sort of make these comparisons, right, in the absence of actually existing slavery. Comparisons, say, between child factory workers in Birmingham and enslaved people in the West Indies. But yeah, I mean, what makes it so difficult to parse is that it was really used by people across the spectrum, from anti-slavery to pro-slavery, labor reformers like
Yeah.
Evans and political abolitionists like William Goodell, and, to slaveholding politicians like James Henry Hammond or George Fitzhugh. Not to mention later generations of labor leaders who keep referring to wage slavery well into the 20th century. I'll just share with you one other image. I mean, this one is from the Library Company. This is a clearly, I think, racist image that is, trying to deprioritize, and gloss over, the plight, the sufferings of enslaved people, in favor of making a point about so-called wage slaves in England. But again, it depends who was wielding it to what ends. I think, many of the labor leaders sort of use it as a kind of exculpatory device to call attention to the plight of free workers and maybe deprioritize abolition. But others like Goodell use it to highlight the danger that slavery posed to free white workers and voters, for that matter, and sort of arguing that they were, maybe one step away from literal enslavement themselves. So it has all different uses, and in some sense, can also be a little distracting once you sort of have to cut through some of that language to get to what they're really talking about and what they really mean.
Well, one of the things I really appreciate about the way you set up your book is you say, especially when you're talking about the labor radicalism, you say that you are sometimes you're going to be talking about people who didn't win. Their ideas did not take root. Sometimes they're shunted aside, they're seen as dreamers, they're seen as impractical, or it's just too far out there. But what I really love about the way you set up the book is that you're showing that those ideas still had a life of their own, that they still influenced and had traction in ways that that you unfold over the course of the book, the way that some of these ideas actually do influence the course of what happened. So how do you like, can you walk us through how some of those ideas that originated with the early labor movement influenced and ultimately shaped what became political anti-slavery by the 1850s? Like we started, sort of early, and you've been sort of moving us through time. But how do those ideas, again, like how do those ideas come to influence the political anti-slavery of the 1850s, and how do they make their way into politics from sometimes very fringe places to something that became such an important part of the political discourse on the eve of the Civil War?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. Yeah, I mean, so you're right. I mean, to some extent, some of the ideas I'm talking about are, kind of a story of paths not taken, and even some of the connections. There's this moment where Evans land reformers are sort of, fostering this alliance, a sort of political coalition with Garrett Smith's wing of the Liberty Party, and it doesn't quite happen, but it almost happened. So but yeah, I mean, I think the ideas do in some cases sort of, make their way into the mainstream, and the political anti-slavery is really kind of the linchpin of this project for that reason. On one hand, there are very basic ideas, like I mentioned, the idea that everyone has a right to the fruits of one's labor. And for some labor reformers, I mean, there's a debate about free labor, right? What it means. For labor reformers, that may entail a right to the whole product of labor, which, the more perceptive of them realize, without having read Karl Marx necessarily, that they're not getting that in the form of wages. And sort of as opposed to abolitionists, or as opposed to what the Republican Party defines as free labor.
Mhm.
Um, but probably the clearest example is the land reform. On the other hand, Lincoln and the Republicans are sort of, making free labor and free soil the center of their appeal, right? I mean, Lincoln is talking about in the Lincoln-Douglas debates having a right to the bread that one's own hand earns, and that's the key to his brand of anti-slavery, and something that I think is readily intelligible to, a large cross section of northern, right, workers, farmers, voters. Then there's the anti-slavery interpretation of the Constitution, which is foundational to all anti-slavery politics, and to some extent is pioneered by, again, Evans and people like William Leggett in the 1830s. Evans writes in 1831 that the idea is too absurd for belief that the framers intended to recognize the right of the minority of people in any state to hold the majority as property. And that sort of becomes the central idea about a decade later of the Liberty Party. In
Mhm.
that same article, he argues that the federal government could possibly abolish slavery, quote, by withholding the means of perpetuating it. And this is what Republicans later call denationalization or divorce from slavery. But probably the most obvious example of what you're talking about is the land reform issue. The land reformers popularize free soil, and they write petitions, and they have some success, right? I mean, they have a more radical conception, again, of free soil than the Free Soil Party or the Republican Party. But they are pointing out that if Western lands were reserved for individual settlers or small family farms, it would make the further expansion of slaveholding plantations impossible. And so they get some legislation passed in places like New York and Wisconsin by the late 1840s. And then, by the late 1850s, the Republicans make homestead reform a major campaign issue. So it's sort of, that's an example of something that sort of goes from the margins to the mainstream. And then, of course, with the passage of the Homestead Act in 1862, this really becomes instrumental. And just one more thing is, there are a number of figures, people like Horace Greeley, who I mentioned, or Parke Godwin, who helps draft the Republican Party platform, or Alvin Beauvais, who's a National Reform Secretary, who's one of the founders of the Republican Party. who sort of either move into anti-slavery politics or, they're members of, or supporters of Fourierism or land reform, and they sort of inject this strain of labor ideology into anti-slavery politics. And they're part of a successful coalition that helps, I think, turn anti-slavery into a mass movement by the mid 1850s.
It's so interesting hearing you connect all these different pieces, the anti-slavery, the desire for land reform, which takes us really out of an urban context. Like one of the things you also pay a lot of attention to is working class people in cities and the importance of agrarian reform to them, or to prevent there being too many of them. I don't know that you're bringing together kind of labor in cities or in industrial settings, land reform and anti-slavery, and of course, all of them come to a head in the 1860s, in part because so many Southern representatives and senators are gone that Congress can take action with the radical Republicans at the wheel that wouldn't have been possible, ironically, if they would have stayed. Um, Speaking of Congress and politics, um, we had an election. I don't know if anyone would have paid attention. It's one of those casual things that maybe you saw, maybe you didn't, last week. And it has been a surprise for many, how much the Republican Party in this most recent election swept the electoral vote and even the popular vote in ways that we were right up to the very end being told this is neck and neck. It could go either way. We just don't know. And that's not what it's going to look like in the history books. So some people are suggesting that this is representative, and we don't know yet, but that this is representative of a major political paradigm shift, and that the Republican Party has been much more attractive in increasingly creating a coalition that includes working class voters who had once been Democratic and increasingly are appealing to people of color who are also working class, where before it was sort of white working class. Whereas Democrats are increasingly becoming seen as the party of the educated elite. And then there are others sort of going off to third parties that are not yet quite so viable as compared to the Democrats and the Republicans. So I guess I'm raising all of this because I am wondering, and I'm hoping this is the million-dollar question, but do you see parallels at all between the political situation that you're describing and the way that these coalitions change over time and the way the Republicans are able to build on them in a 19th century context? Do you see any parallels between what's going on in the 1840s and 1850s with what's happening now? And if so, where do you see them? What do you have to tell us?
Yeah, I mean, the book can't answer these questions, obviously, but some of these things were on my mind. I mean, I finished the dissertation. I was finishing the dissertation in 2016, and
You say in your
we're
introduction you finished it on
You're
Election Day
right. You're
2016.
right.
Oh my
Just
gosh.
I'm just trying to make it feel not quite so old, but that was a while
That's a,
ago. But,
that's
we're already hearing some of the same kind of post-mortem conversations. Was it race? Was it economic populism? And clearly the answer was both in 2016 and now, and in the 1840s and 50s. And so, the book does try to sort of address some of those issues for people who are interested maybe in some of the origins of these, both the issues of race and whiteness, and some of the economic stuff. It's much less clear, frankly, I think, what the sort of self-interest is for many working class folks this time around. But regardless, I think the bigger similarity is just or similarities is, I mentioned to some extent what's happening in the 1840s and 50s is a mainstreaming of political ideas that, were once seen as radical and beyond the pale, like anti-slavery, right? I mean, William H. Seward says in the late 1850s that anti-slavery has at length become a respectable element in politics, right? And that took decades to happen. But there's also a sort of political realignment or paradigm shift, if you put it, as you put it, which is transforming the North and sort of hastens the coming of the Civil War, just with the emergence of the Republican Party, which is the most successful third party movement in American history. And the early Republican Party, some listeners might be surprised to know, really was a progressive party in some ways. This cartoon is sort of lampooning that. But not only because of its embrace of anti-slavery, but it embraces homestead reform and public education and progressive taxation and the use of government power to emancipate slaves during the Civil War and protect freed people during Reconstruction. That sort of progressive moment doesn't last. The party sort of quickly becomes the party of big business and finance. But the Democratic Party is transforming too. You sometimes find these arguments, as people are sort of pointing, to the Democratic Party in the 1850s as though they're the same today. And it was horribly racist, but it was also the Democratic Party in the 1850s was the conservative party, right? And it was, beholden to the slave power, as opponents called it. And labor reformers, including, like most of them are former Democrats, like George Henry Evans, refers to the Democratic Party as the Tory party, the little Tory party of holdbacks, right? And sort of expresses this hope that it will be replaced by a genuine labor party. So there seems to be something similar going on in terms of this sort of shift in what the two parties represent to folks, and maybe also this yearning for other alternatives, better alternatives.
All right. I want to ask you to bring it back to sorry, I'm just realizing something. I posted all these links and I think the chat only goes to the host and panelists. So I took the care to do it, and I don't think any of you in the ether out there got it. So I apologize. And if we are able to send it out to you, I will, but otherwise, hopefully you were paying attention at the beginning. At any rate, sorry, Sean. What I want to do is now bring it back to Philadelphia, which is where I am and where the library company is. And you talked about having a wonderful experience at the library company. I'm really glad to hear that. Philadelphia had the largest free Black population in the antebellum United States. How did African Americans in Philadelphia or elsewhere participate in this early labor movement? It's such a fraught place, so close to the South here in Philadelphia, but it's also such an important place to the labor movement. So how are free African Americans part of this conversation here? Like if bringing it just to one place, to Philadelphia. Oh, thank you so much, Grace.
Yeah, well, to focus on Philadelphia for a minute, if we're a little short on time, I mean, I could talk about John C. Bowers, who's just one figure. There are so many we could talk about, but I mean, really, I think it's one of the important interventions the book makes is showing how African Americans, free Blacks in the North, did participate in the early labor movement and shared many of the same goals, ideals. Often they arrived at similar conclusions independently. They're particularly interested in land reform because they share this sort of aspiration to landed independence. And people know about Garrett Smith's land reform scheme. He allies himself with George Henry Evans, but also with people, Charles B. Ray and James McCune Smith and other free Black leaders in New York City. But Bowers is a member of this, very active African-American community in Philadelphia. He's a member of, Philadelphia's sort of known for these voluntary organizations and societies. And so he's a member of the colored conventions, these all Black conventions that took place in the period, and the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, and he's an Odd Fellow. And I just sort of reminded myself today, he was a member of the library company. I don't know if that means he was a shareholder. I haven't delved that deeply, but maybe something we could look into. But, Bowers appears, not very much is known about him. Most of what is some of it is in the library company's archives. But in 1851, he appears as a delegate at the National Industrial Congress, which is this annual gathering of labor reformers. And there's a debate, right, about whether he can be seated. And a few of the delegates, including John Campbell, storm out, but ultimately the integrationists win the day, and Bowers is seated and takes part in the convention. So as far as I know, he's not really heard from again, at least in that context, in a labor context. But at the next Industrial Congress the following year, another Black man, William H. Day, serves as one of its secretaries. So there are these kind of small victories, but they're significant because, I mean, these are probably the first examples of Black participation in an integrated, labor organization. I mean, they're forming their own organizations in some cases, but probably the first before the Civil War, and really, almost the only ones even afterwards until we
Mm.
get to the 20th century, with the exception of groups like the Knights of Labor and this sort of brief window.
Sorry, tell me
Um,
again, what year was that Bowers was finally seated?
1851 at the
Huh.
Industrial Congress in Albany, New York. So he
Yeah, no,
traveled to
I'm just
Philadelphia.
thinking about the destruction of Pennsylvania Hall in Philadelphia, which is in I'm gonna forget the year off the top of my head. I think it's 1830. Uh,
34 or 35,
thank
maybe.
you.
Yeah. Which
I was
there had been a labor reform. I think it's called something like the Unrequited Labor Reform Gathering, like the night before it's burned down, and then
You're
there's
right. And well,
abolition
and
the
just
following.
the proximity that having black men and black women alongside white men and white women in the space is part of what made it so
Yes.
um, just distressing to enough Philadelphians that they burned it down. Well, we are running low on space in terms of having time for listeners to ask questions. I would like to ask all of you, please, to start populating the chat with your questions so that we can give Sean some opportunity to respond to you. And while we are waiting for that, I will ask you a question that I don't think you have slides for. But it's just something that really struck me in your introduction about the status of labor history. And you talked about how labor history is not really a big part of how we are of in terms of methodologies. There's not a lot of labor history kind of in the tradition of the labor histories of the 1970s and 1980s. And you suggest in your introduction that it's kind of as the labor movement itself kind of atrophied or changed course in the 1980s, that labor history also did. And as I mentioned earlier, where Pease is coming up on its 25th anniversary, the sort of moment of reflection on the state of the field in political economy writ large. Why do you think people, or what would you say is the status of labor history today? Like where clearly labor history is still happening, but maybe not in the way that you might find in the 70s and 80s. Like, so what do you think, what can you tell us about sort of where we are in the history of labor history now, the historiography, the state of the field?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have all the answers. I mean, it may, on one hand, I think there are signs of a resurgence, possibly. I'm doing a labor history panel with Seth Rockman at the OAH in Chicago in April. He's certainly someone who sort of, carried the torch for early American labor history. Other people like Bruce Laurie and Mark Lowes and Marcus Rediker have also been doing this stuff more recently. But, I did have to look back to some of the older scholarship, people like David Montgomery and Bernard Mandel, even sort of popular historians from the, 30s, 40s, 50s. And, I don't know if, I mean, I think in part it's maybe within the field of early American history, it's not always recognized that, there is such a thing as a labor movement before the Civil War. To some extent, that's a product of, again, the early labor historians, John Commons and others who sort of, denigrate the utopians and land reformers and so on. Um, but as far as the state of the field for labor history as a whole, I mean, it may be reflective of the status of the labor movement, which the sort of declining fortunes of the labor movement. Although again, one hopes there may be signs of a resurgence, and at the same time, the rise of the neoliberal university. Frankly,
Hmm.
I'm not sure how interested departments are in people who are labor historians per se, but That said, there are other people doing labor history in other disciplines and in, other periods and, transnationally and globally. So I wouldn't completely write it off.
No, no, I wouldn't either. I think it's an interesting question that I hope you and we and the larger group of participants will continue to engage with, because I think labor history is still alive and well, actually, but it's happening in other, it wouldn't call itself labor history. And that
Yeah.
strikes me just because my last fireside chat was with Michael Blakeman in September, and his book could be considered economic history, but he would not describe it as economic history. And sort of these categories like labor history or economic history, um, I feel like have morphed maybe, and the people who are actually in fact doing work that might fit within those realms would not self-describe themselves as necessarily doing it. You are looking at labor history, but it's also, you're also bringing to it anti-slavery and this larger intellectual realm. So it's just it strikes me how people think about defining the methodologies that they're using, when in
Yeah.
fact I think there's a wide range of people who are doing labor history, but they wouldn't call themselves that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big criticisms of the slavery and capitalism, the recent literature, was that they, hadn't paid enough attention to the older economic history, or, I sort of earlier alluded to, not paying attention to free labor or to wage labor. So yeah, there's certainly lots of room for study of this stuff, I think.
Well, we have a question from John Peel. Thank you very much. He asks, what kind of work did Blacks in Philadelphia do around 1790? And how many of them were still enslaved at that time?
Um, if you're familiar with sort of, the history of emancipation in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, rather, I mean, it's the first state to pass an Emancipation Act, which it does in 1780, the Gradual Abolition Act. And so, but that, uh, you know, basically recognizes the freedom of the children of enslaved mothers upon reaching a certain age. So in Pennsylvania and most other northern states, for that matter, New York and New Jersey, Connecticut, it takes a generation or so. Usually the age is set at 25 or 28 years. So there are still enslaved people, certainly in Philadelphia in the 1790s, and even going into the 18 teens and 20s. Although the sort of passage of the law so hastens the demise of slavery even before that. I don't know as much about you know what free Black Philadelphians are doing for labor, but sort of uh, free Blacks in the antebellum North generally are sort of, they're relegated to, some of the humblest occupations. I mean, a relatively high status occupation is hairdresser, for
Mhm.
example. And there's sort of this phenomenon of Black hairdressers. Many others are, household or domestic servants and chimney sweeps and, oyster sellers or produce sellers. And others are doing, sort of skilled labor as well. But as time goes on, that actually becomes less the case, in part as a result of sort of successive waves of immigration who, at times the immigrants, Irish and German immigrants, displace them from these
Mhm.
fields. And that leads to tensions as well. And there certainly are sort of labor, there's a history of sort of, labor tension, African Americans being used as strike breakers, and so on and so forth. But yeah, it's a
Um,
great question.
your answer segues really well into the next question, which comes from Carolyn Zola, who is our current Pease postdoc, and she is working on a marvelous book manuscript about female hucksters in Philadelphia, among other places. She asks, so she says, thank you for this rich conversation. She says, I'm curious how women workers and gender ideologies more broadly fit into this story. And it does seem like a very masculine world that you're describing in this intellectual and formal political discourse. So how can you answer, Carolyn? How do women as workers, but also ideologies of gender intersect with the story that you're telling us?
Yeah, great question. Again, thinking about African American women, Maria Stewart is someone who certainly sort of makes these connections between the exploitation of, of her as a laborer and the sort of gender component, and the fact that, emancipated African Americans like her are sort of relegated to these lowly jobs, household domestic servants and cleaners and so on, and not able to sort of use their full intellectual capacities and so on. There are women who appear in my story, who are labor leaders, women like Sarah Bagley, who's a leader of the New England Labor Reform Association, and actually edits the Voice of Industry, a major labor newspaper at one point. But yeah, I mean, as far as the gendered component, this in some ways this really is a pretty masculine story, although there are these sort of experiments, particularly in the Fourierist communities, of sort of gender equality, and even what gets labeled as free love, quote unquote, these sort of experimentations with marriage and making marriage more equitable for women in particular. So there are these really, in some ways, really progressive and radical components. Frances Wright, who's another figure who's associated in the 1820s with both anti-slavery and labor reform, who's sort of trailblazing feminist thinker. But it is sort of masculine in the sense, or masculinized in the sense, especially I think when it comes to the land reformers, in that they're envisioning these small family farms on the homesteads as sort of with the male head of household, bread earners, and women, and the labor of women and children is sort of ancillary to that, which is by the way how employers also sort of continue to in the period and much later sort of deny anything like pay equity, because the assumption is that any wages, I mean, number one, that the domestic labor and household labor that women are performing doesn't count as a form of wage labor, and number two, that any labor that women are performing outside the household is supplementary to the husband's labor.
Um, I'm just thinking about Lincoln and his you get to keep the bread that you earn. Of course, you're not baking the bread. It's probably your wife.
True,
um,
true. Although
the ways that it's kind of baked in, into the discourse without even being recognized.
yeah, but he uses that same phrase several times during the Lincoln Douglas debates, and at least one time he uses a female pronoun, right?
Mm.
The bread that her hand earns. So what does that mean? I'm not sure, but
Mm.
at least an acknowledgement there.
Well, again, and thank you, Carolyn, for the question. I think it's another one that bears further thinking.
Yeah, lots of
Um,
on that subject.
what about, I mean, one of the things that happens because you go from 1790 to 1860, we are looking at a period where there are a lot of different conflicts, war, and I wonder whether if I'm thinking actually of the those of us in Philly were treated last week to a marvelous series of lectures by David Waldstreicher about the rise of or a sort of a long history of anti-slavery, which he points out is not necessarily the same as abolition. You can be anti-slavery without being an abolitionist.
Yeah.
But he made a sentence, he said something that's stuck with me since. I wrote it down. Um, about war made slavery and slavery made war. And I'm curious, taking that sentence from David to heart, how you see the labor movement and this discourse around the fruits of one's labor and land and the rest of it. Like war is actually is happening over the time period that you're talking about. It's implicit in how that land is actually going to be made available. It is important in generating the demand for the goods that laborers are making, whether those wars are in North America or somewhere else on the globe. How do you see, and obviously it's very important to the extension of slavery and the perpetuation of slavery. So I'm just curious, and it's sort of a off the cuff question, but how do you see war playing into the story of labor and anti-slavery?
Yeah. I think in the period I'm talking about, it's really the Mexican-American War, that is instrumental, that sort of wakes a lot of labor reformers and others up, and one might expect them as sort of patriotic Americans, who at least to some extent they're excited about expansion and want to settle Western lands and so on, but they're really most of them quite opposed to the Mexican War. And I think it's because they recognize, right, that it threatens to open the Western lands. I mean, Texas is already fait accompli, and now, these other lands, potentially the Mexican cession to slavery. And so I see that in the book. It's kind of a hinge in the book, kind of a transformative moment.
Mhm.
My book, for better or worse, doesn't delve. There's an epilogue in the Civil War and Reconstruction, but um, who am I trying to think of? There has been some great work showing how ordinary soldiers, I mean, maybe Mount Laus's work, or excuse me, Mark Laus's work I could point to, or Matthew Stanley, about sort of workers, working class Northerners in the Civil War, and how they're impacted by the war, and um, how in some cases it really forces a change of attitudes about slavery and emancipation, not to mention people of color.
Mhm. Well, this has been fantastic. It's so exciting to get to enter into this world, your intellectual world as you have created this book, and the way that it really does have resonances, I think, of that are important in this current moment that we find ourselves in, and thinking about questions of reform, questions of radicalism, how labor radicalism or the politics around access to control of labor and capital and the deployment of race in all of that, all of those conversations, how we can think about that in the present. So thank you for letting us into your world, for taking us through some of the things you work on or talk about in your book. And those of you who are, we can't see you, but I hope that you are clapping, and I will be the one to do it live and say thank you, Sean. This has
Thank you so
been
much.
this has been the Fireside Chat for this time. Please join us again in about a month for Randy Brown, and otherwise enjoy your night, and thank you so much for spending part of it with us.
Thank you, Jess, and thanks to the Library Company, which everyone should support.
Yes, like Bowers. Bowers is a
Yes,
library company
I'll sit
shareholder.
down.
That's amazing.
Let's emulate his example.
That's right. All right. Till next time, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.